like throwing myself into this weirdness of like, I don't know what the heck this syntax is. I don't know how to think through this. But the more you do it, the faster you become and the better you become at it.
I think the really interesting place to start would be when we talked about talking, you mentioned growth and despair in careers. Let's start
Yeah.
with that. What do you mean by that? What's this despair in your career?
So I've been a software engineer professionally for 21 years, and a few years before that, like I guess unprofessionally, if you will, back in college and stuff, like hacking on stuff. Um, but I've been pretty lucky throughout my career. Like I landed in good places, had good mentors, managers, and all that, and kept growing and growing. And I want to say maybe about 14, 15 years into my career, sort of after the senior engineer spot, right? Like I graduated or became a principal engineer at Amazon. Okay, we can, if you are interested, we can talk later about the whole other paths leading up to that, but we're going to just start from there at this point, right? So, principal engineer in Amazon, I think at that point there was maybe less than 1% of the engineers at Amazon, so a pretty senior role. It's almost like a technical as well as a leadership role, although you're not a man manager. It's kind of like staff engineers or senior staff engineers that you see at other places, right? And leading up to that, for the last 4 or 5 years, I was kind of like, really aspiring and excited to get to that level and work across like big initiatives across many multiple teams and all that. So it was a pretty big like moment for me personally. Um, and it's not like a easy step to get to. Like there's a lot of peer review and interview and all that kind of, there's like a committee, well, not a committee anymore in Amazon, there used to be, but at least couple of other established principal engineers looking at your portfolio of work across the last like 6 7 years and kind of deciding, are you up to that bar or not, and all sorts of things, right? So it was a pretty intense process of like 2 3 years leading up to it to get to that level. So I was really excited. And I think the first few months were really like exciting for me, because another thing in Amazon as well as other like bigger companies is you have to be performing in a role already to be promoted. Right, that's pretty typical in big companies. Is to become a senior engineer, you have to be doing the work of a senior engineer pretty much immediately. So in a way, I was probably already working as a principal engineer. I was working with about 3 4 teams at that time. But the transition I sort of started seeing after the first 4 to 6 months is a lot of my work became very very distant from like actually what we were building immediately in the moment. And I started feeling that I was starting to get frustrated with that, right? It was very strategic kind of long term kind of work, and very complex kind of work. As an example, I was in AWS at that time, and one of the products we wanted to build was for the, basically how people would use that is you would get notifications when anything across any of your like 200 AWS services happen, and you could customize it like very specifically using rules. And as probably people know, AWS is a very high availability and region isolated kind of structure, right? Like your data will never cross the boundaries of a region and that sort of thing. Those are like set in stone. Whereas for this kind of thing, what we needed is no matter where the notification is, it needs to end up in your email inbox or Slack or things like that. And so there were like organizational principles and barriers that I had to kind of uh, rewrite or kind of convince leadership of that this is the right thing to do, and this is how we are going to honor the high availability and region isolation things, even though we're delivering kind of like a single pane of glass kind of product, right? That's bringing you information from all your products, all your services, and all your regions into one single place. And that ended up being maybe like a 6 to 8 month journey to write various forms of documents for, because you can't expect like a CEO or an SVP at a AWS level organization with like, I don't know, tens of thousands of engineers, right? Maybe at this point, to understand each and every nitty gritty detail, right? So you have to like kind of write for the leadership. And Amazon, it's a very writing driven culture. We don't go do presentations and all that. So I think what I realize is what I'm doing is really important, really strategic work. This will open up a lot of doors, but at the same time, I have no connection with what we're building right now anymore.
Just that begs a question immediately because a lot of people wonder this. Did you write any code at all during that 6 to 8 months there? Or is it all
Um,
documentation?
no, I mean, I did write code, but that was more or less because I wouldn't survive like a month if I don't write code. I think it was, I could have easily gone by without writing code. I think the best principal engineers at Amazon actually do it really well, where they are able to balance all of those aspects. Another thing I did, it's not super common at Amazon, is I didn't get out of the like the on-call rotation, right? Because I felt like the on-call rotation is a really good way, even though it's stressful. It's a good way for me to keep up to date with what are the things that are wrong, right? And the kind of opinion within the Amazon principal community is divided. Like some principal engineers are, some aren't in it, and for good reasons, both ways. But yeah, I tried to keep my hands dirty, but I think there was definitely a sense of like, this is not what I'm going to be rewarded for, right? What I'm going to be rewarded for are these big kind of uh, organization wide framework changes or things like that that I influence and come to come to fruition maybe in 4 years, 5 years down the line. um, and I think at my heart I was struggling with that because I just see myself as a builder more than anything else, and I was getting really really frustrated. And that's kind of like what led to the the growth story and then the despair part of it. Yeah.
But it's true of
Yeah.
so many things, isn't it? Once you get to that certain level,
Yeah.
you move away from the code, you move away from being a builder, and you have to
Yeah.
build for other people. You have to build via that aligning the resources of the organization, whether that's your computing resources, your financial resources, your
Yep.
development resources. You start spending less and less time actually building and more time trying to
Yeah.
create that alignment. And whether you're doing that as a manager, trying to align people and vision and so on, or whether you're doing that from the technical side, trying
Yeah.
to align the technical vision, you just find you like less and less code. And I think that's something that a lot of us find difficult to accept because I think both of us, I'm guessing, quite like being hands on, quite like still building stuff.
Right.
I'm coding interpreters and compilers right now for fun.
Right. Right.
You know,
and
that's
and there's nothing bad about either of these paths, right? Like you discover for your own what you like to do. There are people who like, they're my mentors that are still there. I talk to them once in a while, right? They're extremely good at the principal, or some are like senior principal level. That's like maybe 0.01% of Amazon engineering community, right? That sort of level, and they're doing an extremely good job, both kind of influencing the long term direction of what they're doing and keeping up to date with things. And some of them are like into the prototyping, maybe the early stage of it, but it's very rare. Yeah. And I think personally, what hit me is it's very hard to balance those things at the expectation levels of like being a principal engineer or a staff engineer at a company like that.
cool. So, in the last 5 minutes, you mentioned good mentors several times.
Yeah.
So, what's a good mentor to you? What's been a good example of someone that's really stood out and why they've been a good mentor and how that's helped you?
Yeah. Um, I wouldn't name names, but I think people who know, who are my mentors would probably know me. I would take examples of three mentors that I have had over like the last 15 years ish years, right? Um, First one I would say is worked pretty closely with me was within kind of the purview of the organization, and so they knew sort of the in and out of the technical stuff that I was working on. Okay. So, what I could discuss with them is when there were really complex kind of decisions to make, I could bounce around with them, get their opinions on it, and also get a different perspective, usually, on these things. So, from a technical perspective, I love that person. um, the other two mentors were from completely different parts of Amazon. Okay. One was from Audible. I was in AWS, and this person was in Audible, which is the like audiobooks and podcasts and that space, right? Nothing to do with AWS. And what that person always had me think was whenever I would go and discuss, kind of like, hey, I'm thinking about building this kind of a thing. What do you think? He would go back to the first principles about like, who is exactly, because he doesn't understand our like AWS customers as much as we do, but he would ask those very basic questions like, why would I do this, why would I use this versus that other thing, or why would I need to configure all these things to use this product? Because when you're building for like enterprise in AWS, for example, most of your products tend to be very very configurable, like lots of different ways people are going to use it, and it's more lower level kind of infrastructure as a service. I was more in the product as a service side, but it's very configurable. Versus what they're building in the consumer side is for like everybody, it's the same product for everybody, like Audible the app, right? So he would ask a very different perspective of questions. And then the third mentor, I would say, he was in South Africa, and then Ireland now. And this person had a very, like, down to the earth kind of, even though he was a senior principal engineer, he was always open to, it doesn't matter whether I want to talk about tech or some personal struggles or this whole growth and despair part. I talked to him for months on end about like, hey, how did you go across this, did you ever feel like this, what do you want to do? He is actually the one that echoed and maybe convinced me that maybe I should take a pause and like figure out if what I want to do long term. And it's not always bad to like, you're familiar with the concept of golden handcuffs, I guess, right?
Yeah,
At these big
yeah,
companies. So so at like a senior level, you do get paid a lot of money. There's a lot of stocks coming every year. So it's not always easy to say like, maybe you should take a pause and stop that. And maybe even if you don't like doing whatever you think you will end up like doing, maybe there's a path back into this if you want to. So that sort of stuff. And I think all three kinds of aspects of mentors are very very valuable. um, and then I would say one more, and this is actually, she was my mentee, so I was her mentor, but for the most part what happened is this person was a teacher for the longest term time, and then she changed her career and became a software engineer through a boot camp. Happened to join like our team in Amazon, and this was maybe about 10 years back, and I sort of like brought her into our team from a different team and became her mentor. Um, and I feel like in the beginning, she was learning a lot from me. But towards the end, I started learning a lot more about how she thinks through, because she has been teaching like kindergarten students and like smaller kids all her life. And the way she kind of goes into a maybe a hard conflicting kind of team situation where there's multiple different opinions and people are having a hard time kind of getting their point across, the way she would come in and resolve those situations, I started learning a lot more from her. So that was, I think, I would say I started as a mentor, but eventually I became a mentee of her. So yeah.
those are some of the best relationships, and the great benefit of mentoring, isn't it? Is that you
Yeah.
can learn as much from the person you're mentoring as they can learn from you. So apart from that last one that you said you brought into your team, The other three sounded as though they were very culturally, geographically, and even organizationally quite diverse.
Yeah,
AWS and Audible, very different
yeah,
companies to my mind.
yeah,
AWS built in house by Amazon with your infrastructure. Audible was an acquisition, I believe, going back
yeah,
quite a while.
yeah,
You say one is infrastructure as code and a whole bunch of enterprise services. The other is a consumer app to sell as
yeah,
Audible books. So,
yeah.
how did you end up with finding these diverse mentors?
That's a great question. So I think, first of all, inside these big companies, there are channels built in already for like finding mentors and stuff like that. But I'd take this question as like, I think let's take it to the next level. Whether there are organizational channels and mechanisms available to find such mentors or not, I think as a software engineer, maybe in any career actually, it's important to find such mentors with diverse perspectives. And it doesn't you don't have to immediately commit to somebody, right? Like, it's a long term relationship, but it's not, you can kind of like go for a coffee chat with them or meet them virtually, whatever it is. See if you like each other's vibe, if you get like positive from that relationship. If you like it, it can be very fulfilling. But I would say date around, I guess, or to find the right mentor or mentors for you within your organization. So in big companies, like in Amazon, we had like a whole internal tool dedicated to finding mentors and kind of checking in with them and communicating with them and all that. And I didn't use any of the rest of that, like the communication or check-ins and all that, but I did use it to find such mentors. And so that's the first part. As a junior engineer, I was able to find some of them. And then I think in most companies also, at that staff or principal or sometimes even senior, depending on the size of the company, there are communities of those engineers built in, right? So in Amazon we had like a principal, I forget what it was called, but a community. So every Wednesday there would be a lunch and learn. All the principal engineers across Amazon, well, not all, but almost all of them would come in, and there's a very vibrant kind of stimulating conversation. And through there, you would also find people that you feel like, okay, I really resonate with that person. Let me send them an email and see if they're up for a chat. Yeah. So yeah, but I think the main point is it is important to find such different perspectives. Um, I would say maybe even, and like I said in my case, most of them were really senior to me, but one of them was junior to me, and I ended up learning a lot from her as well. So it's kind of important to, I think, have those relationships. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and you mentioned just like meet people and reach out and ask and inquire. I think people forget that you can just do that. And what's the worst that can
yeah,
happen? They say no.
yeah. I've had
I
plenty of, I mean, these people are busy, right? Especially the senior people. So
yeah,
I've had times where I sent an email saying, "Hey, I'm looking for a mentor. Are you up for a chat?" And some of them outright said like, "No, I can't do it right now. Like, my hands are full," right? Some of them had said, "You know what, I don't have time for like a recurring monthly kind of thing, but if you have a specific problem, I'm happy to talk about that." And I met a couple of people like that, that ended up, I think, after meeting a couple of times, like I went to them with a very specific problem, technical problem. We talked about it, then we ended the engagement. 6 months later, I said, "Hey, you know what, we talked about that thing, we launched this, and now we are thinking about like a V2 of this thing. Do you want to have a chat?" We had that chat. So those are also valuable, but more, I think, targeted, very, very specific, generally probably in a more technical sense than as a life mentor or life coach or that sort of perspective.
yeah. And I like the way you
Yeah,
put it earlier as well. Like date around, go and try different
yeah,
mentors.
yeah.
I'm now kind
Like
of
you
imagining
said,
that any.
like, yeah, like you said, worst thing they can say is no, and you're no better or worse off than you were like 10 minutes before. So yeah.
Yeah, and I'm now imagining if anybody's stuck for a startup idea, Tinder for mentors.
Yeah, actually, somebody, a principal engineer from Amazon, they actually also started a podcast about a few months back. So he actually said that he's having a lot of success with a thing called Mentor Cruise. I don't know if you have heard about it, if you have
I
used
have heard of
it,
it.
or
Yeah,
in. Yeah, so he said that he has met a lot of great people through Mentor Cruise. He's an ex principal engineer. He also kind of got burnt out and left Amazon and is kind of doing this as his full time thing now. So yeah,
Cool. So, talking of startup ideas, then let's pivot to this quickly. Then you are
yeah,
now doing a startup. How did that come
yeah.
about? Is that part
Um,
of the despair or the result of the despair?
uh, a little bit. So let's go back a few years. So I actually spent about 14 years at Amazon, but that was in two stints. Okay, so I landed in Amazon as a pretty fresh, like SDE one, pretty green. Um, and then I worked across Amazon, like three different parts of Amazon, and then there was always an itch in me to like go and work at a very small company, very early stage company. So I left and did that. I actually tried once before to work at a startup. I moved to India, moved back to India, I would say, from Seattle, and joined a very small stage company. And we had fun. I think we built something pretty interesting, but it was not. We were not seeing good like growth signals and all that. And at the same time, I kind of felt like, okay, I need to actually go back to North America because of my daughter. She loved her life there. She was very young at that time, but we could see that she loved her life there, and she's not like really getting into it there. So we decided to move back. So I joined Amazon back, but there was always a part of me that was like, I want to work in a very small environment and do something. I have the ownership as well as the burden of taking the right or wrong decisions. Actually, Ilya is my co-founder. We talk about this quite a lot internally too. We'll maybe touch upon it today later on. But the key difference of like working as a very high level senior employee in a company versus as a startup like kind of co-founder, what are the differences in there, right? So we were talking about it. And so like I always wanted to do that. And as I was going through this despair period around like 2021 ish, I would say, Ilya and I had lots of chats. Ilya and I used to work together in Seattle for about 5 years. We worked together. Then he moved to Google. I continued on AWS. Um, and we actually kind of at the same time arrived at this thing that we both love podcasts. We want to do something together. And none of the podcast apps out there are like doing what we wanted out of it. So we were like, why don't we take a bet on it? We did some analysis about like what could be the possibility in this space, and decided to build it. So that's how we kind of ended up there. Yeah,
Cool. So, what did
yeah,
you decide is a kind of killer feature for a podcast app that was missing?
yeah. So this is about 2021, right? So Ilya and I both listen to kind of knowledge heavy podcasts. Sort of like I listen to a lot of science as well as a lot of history. Uh, Growing up, I don't know if it was me or the schooling system or whatever. I learned a lot of factual kinds of history, especially region specific in India, but not of the like politics or the personal side of history all across the world, right? And I really got intrigued by it later on as an adult, learning about the personal stories of history, right? And so I do listen to a lot of history podcasts. I do listen to a lot of science podcasts. And the thing that kept bugging me, and Ilya and I talked, it was exactly the same thing, is we would hear something and it's kind of like a flow of information coming towards you. If you retain it, great. But it's very hard to go back and find that specific thing. Like if you remember. So I'll give you a specific example. Okay. So there's a episode of Neil deGrasse Tyson talking about the Gregorian calendar, right? The
Hmm.
calendar that we use right now. Why are there 28 days in February, and why is there a leap day every 4 years, and every 100 years there's like a change to that as well? Where did we end? How did we ended up on all of this? And he has a beautiful story talking about all of this, right? And I know the podcast that I heard this in. I don't remember the episode, and I don't remember especially the specific segment in there. So I think we are not there yet with Metacast is a podcast app we're building. Ultimately, I'll kind of tell you what I want to do is I just want to type in Neil deGrasse Tyson Gregorian calendar and find that specific segment. Okay. Where we are at right now is if you know the podcast, there is a pretty decentish search inside the episodes already. Like for example, for coding chats, if you go to the coding chats in the Metacast app and search for like a topic or a guest name based on some metadata, this is not great yet, but you can find that episode. Once you open up that episode, the whole transcript is there for you to search and bookmark and all that. And we are adding more and more. This is still like two-person project, so progress is a little bit slower. I would say it's pretty complex because we're building apps as well as the website at the same time. But we have made decent progress on that already. But the idea is that you can find things like this. You don't have to remember the podcast name or maybe even the person who said it and things like that. Like if you search for a Gregorian calendar origin, you should be able to find this piece of beautiful information. Um, and the
That's
and the
very cool.
second part, why podcast is there is something about the audio medium that Ilya and I both captivate towards. I know different people learn different ways. Some people love YouTube videos. Some people love blog posts and reading and kind of reading books like that. I have always been into like audiobooks and podcasts, and something about the creator's voice talking to me kind of has a deeper connection than I think just as I get from reading or and I don't usually have the time to like go through video. Like when I'm doing dishes or going for a dog walk, I don't actually be wanting to watch a YouTube video at the same time. So that kind of juxtaposition of the audio medium, finding all this rich information that's already in there, but kind of the ability to quickly find or go back to that piece of interesting thing I heard or bookmark it, share it with others. Those are the things that we felt were lacking. And so we built that part. Yeah.
That's very cool because I do have a number of podcast episodes that I've never finished
Right.
because I've been listening to them while I'm walking the dog and I go, oh, that's a brilliant idea. I need to take that and use that. So I'll
Right.
pause the episode so that I can rewind 30 seconds, listen to it.
Right.
And then I'll finish my dog walk. And then sometimes when I get back to the office or home, I remember and I listen to it and take a note. Other
Yeah.
times I forget about it and I'll lose that little stroke of genius or I'll remember it a little bit later. On
Right.
some of them, the podcast episode has been so good. I've done this 5 or 6 times and I never actually get past the first 10 minutes of the podcast because I keep pausing it and never listening to it all. So that would be a really useful feature.
Right.
That'd be great. So the interesting thing that you mentioned, though, is audio and podcasts. And I've got a mixed feelings about this. So for decades, I think myself, like a number of other people, had viewed podcasts as dying. Why
Mm-hmm.
would anyone listen to podcasts anymore? I've now got Audible. I listen to audiobooks when
Mm-hmm.
I'm driving or walking. When I'm not, when I'm at home, I've got YouTube, so I might watch videos on there. So, and again, I'm kind of guilty of this, and it's more not being aware of what's going on outside our own bubble. So until I joined a podcast company in 2022, I thought podcasts were dead and gone. So when I joined
Right.
the podcast company, I found it's still a massively growing market.
Right. Yeah.
Hence why subsequently I've created my own podcast now, and here we are talking.
Right.
I did see a thing in some of the industry press a couple of days ago saying that YouTube was now kind of dominating the podcasts.
Right.
YouTube has captured a lot of the market. It's
Right.
zoomed past Spotify and this, and it's pushed video podcasts. Video podcasts are now the thing and the most popular. How do you feel about that? How do you see that fitting in the industry as you're building a podcast app?
Yeah. So I think, do you know Justin Jackson?
Yep.
He runs Transistor FM. He did a great post about it, and I mean, I'm not going to be able to do justice to what he typed it. So go. I would say for anybody listening to this, go read his blog post on this. But I'll give you my perspective on it. Okay, is video has a certain definitely a appeal to it, right? For me, the appeal of video podcast is for know how or how to do things kind of podcast. I love the video medium for that. For example, I'll give you two examples. One is Hanselman, Scott Hanselman from Microsoft,
Hmm.
and the Microsoft Azure like CTO. They have a podcast where they kind of do about 15-20 minutes every week on how to do certain things. For example, use like Windows power tools kind of things. Okay, so those podcasts, I think audio is a horrible medium for that because you
Yeah.
need to be actually watching what they're doing while they're describing it to make any sense out of it. I have tried the audio part of it, and I think some of it doesn't make sense in that way. Another example is I'm a big tennis nerd, right? So the tennis podcasts where they talk about tournaments and results and all that, those are great in audio. I'll get to it in a second. But there are a lot of podcasts that discuss like strategies or tips and techniques for tennis, right? And those I think are much better done in video than in audio because watching it while listening to it at the same time has a certain like more, I think you retain more of it for these kind of tips and techniques kind of things, um, versus let's say history, okay, or even science, like I'm learning something about black holes or like dark matter, things like that. The visuals don't really add much to that. um, Versus, I think what's starting to happen is because video podcasts and YouTube is growing, people are putting more and more effort into the video part of that rather than the content part of that.
Yeah, makes
Okay,
sense.
and I think for me personally, like when I'm out driving or I'm walking the dog, those are the two times a day I always am listening to a podcast or an audiobook. I don't have time for video at that time. I know a lot of people actually at their desk when they're working, they have YouTube up and they're watching something while working on something. My brain doesn't function like that. I can't do it.
Yeah, I'm the same. I can't either.
Yeah, I like when I'm working, I can't even listen to a podcast. I need like music or something. If somebody's talking, my attention just goes to that. So I
Yeah.
can't function that way. So I think there's a lot of people who are going to learn and get introduced into podcasts and all that via YouTube, which is actually great. But I think the use case, if you will, for different types of podcasts for video versus audio is slightly different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. So, pivoting the topic slightly, you mentioned mentor number four was a teacher, a
Yeah.
kindergarten teacher, I think, for many
Yeah.
years, and you learned a lot from her. That strikes me as a non-standard career path,
Yeah.
And as you also mentioned, I think she did a boot camp.
Yeah.
So, what are your feelings on boot camps and the benefits, counter benefits? Do you need a computer science degree to progress as you have for Amazon to principal level?
Right. So I actually never did a CS degree myself. Um, to be fair, I do regret it once in a while, and we'll get to it in a second. But let's first talk about the boot camp part of it. I also didn't do a boot camp and learn through that. I kind of we'll go back to my story in a little bit, but boot camps,
Okay.
I think, for people who are looking to transition into software, it can be like if you're a teacher or you're a nurse. Actually, this person that we are talking about, not only did she jump over, she is the mentor of that kind of a community inside, or was inside Amazon. Now it's outside of Amazon, and she brought in actually another nurse into our team. Actually, three people she brought in from complete like career transitions into our team. I think overall it enriched our team quite a lot with different perspectives. But it can be very hard to jump into software if you have no background in coding at all, right? Because it's a very different kind of the high level thinking and problem solving and all that aside, the actual mechanics of building something is pretty alien to somebody who doesn't know anything about software, right? And then you put in all the kind of architectural blocks that you have to be aware of to build something good, like starting from the basics like a database, which maybe makes sense to a lay person, right? A database is where you store and retrieve information. But then the best way to store and retrieve, the scaling wise efficient way to store and retrieve, caching on top of that, how do you have communicate like different parts of the system? Do you want to build it as a monolith or like distributed architectures, different pieces communicating to each other via messages, serverless functions, like Kubernetes? There's so many things to think through, right? And we're just thinking about the system side of it. There's also the whole like web. If you're building a web or an app, there's an entire different world of things you need to learn. And I think it can be pretty daunting for somebody to come in and not just learn the syntax of programming, which is alien enough already, although it's much better than it was like 20 or 30 years ago. But also all of these other things on their own very quickly. And my transition was kind of like made by myself because I found this world exciting. We'll get to it maybe in a little bit why I did that. But for somebody who's looking to transition, let's say from being a teacher to a nurse, and they're earning money, but they want to transition and do something else, they don't have an infinite amount of like, they can't take like, okay, I'm going to take 5 years to learn all this and then find a job. Right? They need to find a job maybe within 6 months, maybe within
Yeah.
3 months. And so for them, I mean, other than learning all these things very quickly yourself, I think boot camps are a great way to kind of go through the process, learn with others, learn from experienced people. Yeah, I've also run kind of, I wouldn't say these are boot camps in the traditional sense of like 3 to 6 month boot camps, but I've run 1 day camps where you have people coming from a different background. And like, let's say something basic as building a Ruby on Rails website, very basic website, right? You're not deploying it to production, but you see that, okay, I'm writing this and it's showing up in a website here. And that's kind of powerful enough to a lot of people to make that transition or start thinking that I actually want to do this. This is super fun. So, yeah.
Yeah, that I think that's one thing that the web has made so much easier for people coming into software engineering. So, I started coding when I was 9 years old, and for me as a kid, it was like, hey, I can get this graphics to move, and I can create a simple
Right.
computer game,
Right.
which was hard back in those days. It wasn't very
Right.
easy to get to that stage.
Yeah.
Where nowadays you could do that in Python and Pygame very, very quickly and easy. You could do it in the web, or you can get just a web page out and see something. It's so much easier. And that's much more exciting than building a terminal app and much more satisfying.
Yeah. I mean, I also kind of landed up here in a similar way. I was actually a civil engineer. I was going through my undergraduate in civil engineering. And one of the things I built was a software for like estimating the cost of a project, right? So you would take in all the like building materials. You kind of estimate, I want to build this house, let's say, right? So it has these many floors, these are the rooms, these are the dimensions. Based on this, how much raw material am I going to need, how much labor is it going to need, and what is the entire cost of this project, right? Software estimation. And this is, we're talking about like maybe 25 years ago. There's I'm sure there are like 200 different great software doing this, but as a student project, this is the first thing I built. And I did this in Visual Basic. Okay. So it was more or less like plug and play kind of components. But I was mesmerized by the process of building something that others can use and they don't have to go through all these calculations and do it themselves. So then the next year, the project that I picked up was in Visual C++, kind of a traffic signal design based on the data collection was still manual. Like you would collect manually how many vehicles are coming through which intersection from which side manually, but then you feed it into the system and it would, you can say it's linear programming, but this is before I knew what linear programming was. It would kind of do some math and come up with like, this is the most optimized way to arrange the timings for this signal, right? And there was just something fascinating about having a computer do this rather than a person kind of go through these calculations and do it. And so that got me started, and I picked up C++ or something like that after that. And then when I got to the web, I was like, wow, this is super cool. Like I can build things uh, that others can use. And I think maybe that's a part of me that to this day, I love building consumer or things that like people can touch and feel very quickly rather than enterprise backend kind. Even though I spent a lot of my career in AWS in the API and backend side of it, and I love that part of it too. There's just something about bringing something to life that other people, hundreds of other people, can use it, and that just is gratifying to me. So, yeah,
Yeah, definitely. I can agree with that. I've built a few bits of software that were millions of dollars worth of software, but three people in the world ever saw it and used it and know what it
yeah,
did.
yeah,
Massive impact, but when you realise that hardly anyone actually uses it, and you can count your users on one hand,
yeah,
it's quite different from then going, oh, I mean, one of my first things is I built a bot for Quake. Over a
yeah,
million people downloaded that bot. That
yeah.
was quite like, hey, and I was still at university at the time as a student. It's like, hey,
Right,
this is amazing. A
right,
million people can download some software I've written over the internet,
right.
and they're using it. It's mind blowing at
Yeah,
the time.
yeah.
So you've listed quite a array of technologies there. You mentioned Ruby, C++, Visual Basic. You weren't kidding when you said you've tried different things when we talked earlier. So what else have you been
Yeah.
trying? Whatever technology stacks have you played with or worked
So I
with?
think aside from the, if you were to take out, whoever is listening to this, if you were to take out two things from this episode, I would say the first one is finding the mentors, trying out different mentors, the chat that we had maybe about half an hour back. The second thing I would say is try out different technologies, because, well, because we'll get to the because later. But try out different things, just so you get exposed to the different perspectives. And I think in some ways this is the same thing as having different mentors with different perspectives. Is you're going to enrich the way you build software very differently every time you come across a new paradigm of building software in, right? So I started with, like I said, Visual Basic, Visual C++, then C++, and all that. For a while, after that, I worked in like Perl. This was the early Amazon days, so Perl and Mason, those kind of technologies. It was very complex to build anything in it, I would say. And then I think the first wave of, I don't know if you were part of it, but the Ruby and the Rails community back in about 2009 2010ish, maybe a few thousand developers across the world, but that community was like amazing to me. The amount of support and the open source kind of ethos of it, right? Like everything is open. You can read the source code of anything you want, and then you use it to build your own things. You can ask questions if you have a problem. You can report it. You can go fix it yourself, or you can help kind of document why it's not working the way and somebody somewhere sitting across the world is going to help you out without you paying anything to them, right? And just because everybody believed in the open culture of it, and that was amazing to me. uh, so that kind of, I think, kept me going throughout as I get more and more invested in like the software world. So then one of my mentors, I don't remember who, but said you should try out like Lisp style of programming too, because that's a very different way. So and that's when I started getting into the Clojure. I also tried all those other like kind of Lisp. For a good 4 or 5 years, Emacs was my editor. And so I completely was into eLisp, like Emacs. The kind Emacs is an editor built with the Lisp itself, right? So I was heavily into that. And then I think over the last few years, what have I tried? Kotlin, pretty much built a lot of backend things in Kotlin and JVM. And then recently with Metacast, our app is in Flutter, so that's for the Android and iOS apps. And then our website is Next.js with React deployed on Vercel. So I think last 2 3 years too, I'm learning quite a lot, and I have come to realize that I love this experience of learning something from a new framework or from a new programming language, and bringing it, like kind of ingraining it in myself, that this is the right way to like build software. For example, Clojure or Lisp, I don't use it at all, apart from like maybe 2 3 years where I used it a lot. I have not touched it since then. But the way it has completely shaped the way I think about software building, in a way that everything should be small composable functions, and the functional style of programming, right, where you pass data along to things and then they modify it and send back, right? And actually they don't modify it, everything is immutable.
Yeah.
But basically you pass along, thread data along various things, each one is a small unit of capability, and they'll do something with it and give you a different piece of data that you thread along. This is something that I live and die by even now, right? Like all the software I build is sort of like that, where it's small modules of like capabilities that come together to build this whole app that you're experiencing. So for a while in there, I got so much into programming languages, and you are probably more of an programming language nut than I am, because you said you're building like interpreters and stuff like that. But I got really into programming languages, and so I took like a course in programming language design, played around with building my own programming language. There were I don't know if you have read those, but there were two really beautiful books called Seven Programming Languages in 7 Weeks, and then Seven Databases in 7 Weeks. And actually, databases, again, they're not languages, but they also completely reshape the way you think about how you store and manage data. And I think I love those things. So I would like constantly go around, maybe every 6 months, find something else and do it in. And then last thing I would mention is every year, I didn't do it last year actually. Thanks for being in a startup. But till then, last 4 or 5 years, I've been doing the Advent Up code that happens in December. And one of my goals was always to pick a new language to do it in. Because
Cool.
my goal and my capability, to be honest, I'm not going to end up on a leaderboard, right? Like there are people around the world who you post the question get posted at like midnight Eastern US time or something like that, and within 3 4 minutes there are like 15 solutions out there. I'm not one of them. Right? My goal is to actually learn and craft something beautiful, taking maybe 4 or 5 hours of that day, um, and then learn from the process of building it. So for every year, 4 or 5 years, I picked a different language to build it in. And I think I enjoy it. And I think it does enrich the way you, uh, maybe you pick up something and then you leave that world, you go write software in another language, but it fundamentally changes the way you think about building software in that new language.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm
I
actually
completely agree
very
with that.
curious to learn like from you on this too. Like what's your experience? What's your process of picking up new things? Yeah.
I am just curious and I love learning new things. So I have tried to stay away from 7 databases in 7 weeks and 7 languages in 7 weeks because I'll just lose 14 weeks of my life.
Yeah.
I can lose all that time in those
That's
things
just the
already.
title. That's just the title of the book. Yeah. It probably took me like a month to go over them.
I would end up speed running them.
Right. Right.
It's not unknown for me to get through a 300 or 400 page book in a day. So
Right.
if I
Wow.
pick up a book like
Yeah.
that, I will end up working through it as fast as I possibly can. Everything
Right.
else get dropped for a bit. So I don't want to do that because
Right.
I'm trying to do my own startup.
Right.
But I'm
Yeah.
totally with you. I have learned 30 or 40 programming languages at various different levels over the years.
Right.
Maybe even more than that. You know, every time I try and list them, I realize I've forgotten some. And you know, some of those I've learned enough to do the task that I had because that was the job. Some of them I've gone into intense detail. You know, I was passionate about C++ for a while, got involved in the standards process and was involved in the standards committee. I'm less involved in that now. More recently,
Right.
I've done quite a lot of List and Go, and I've been interested in those.
Right.
But every single one, as you say, I've learned something new from it. I've got a different perspective. And that's very, very powerful. I think it makes you a far better software engineer because you realize that programming language is just a tool. You don't have to get wedded to it.
Right.
and they've all got their strengths and weaknesses. They've all got something to take from it. And you say, when you then also look at, imperative language versus a functional language versus an OO language, you can look at all of these and go, well, actually, I really like that part.
Yeah.
That's great. I like the idea of objects. I
Right.
don't like the idea of inheritance and all the complex mess that you get with that.
Or like dependency injection, for example. One of the things Ilya and I had a beef over last week was my TypeScript code tends to have objects and classes and all that, and he was asking me like, why don't we just do functions? And um, maybe this is because I'm pretty new to TypeScript and JavaScript and all that, even though I used it in the web sense. For a backend part of it, I haven't used it much, but a lot of it is also dependency injection. And I found that the best way over time to kind of write unit tests for, in a startup, like, we don't want to write a unit test for everything in there. Maybe even in real world you don't want to. That's maybe not the best use of your time to code up every possible interaction in the system. But in our place, it is pretty important to be able to systematically test various inputs and outputs for some complex, like, let's say, regular expression related things, or something involving a dependency. You do need to know what is the expected input and output, not just to learn it in today's time, but maybe a year down the line. Has anything changed if I change that dependency or upgrade that dependency? Does anything
Yeah.
break, right? So that's kind of important enough. And the best way I found to do those kind of things is to build a decorator or a wrapper around it and have that be a dependency injected, so that you have a very isolated, abstracted layer around that piece of software that is a third party, and the rest of your system doesn't need to know anything about it. But at the same time, you can test that very easily and know that whether it's working or not if you upgrade or change that dependency or something like that. And whether that's in TypeScript or Clojure or whatever, I'm not going to go away from that concept, right? So yeah.
And that sort of harks back to what you said before about the functional style, where your function is going to take in some data which is immutable, or you treat
Yeah.
as immutable if you're not using a language that has that. And you're going to apply an operation to it, and you're going to return that data back.
Yeah.
So again, you're not changing the input, but you have no side effects in a functional style, but you're
Yeah.
going to change this data back. Again, that makes your code a lot easier to test. If you have,
Yeah.
avoid side effects in your phone, you treat all the data that comes in as immutable. Again, a good style to pick up, and you can apply that whether you're working in a functional language, imperative language, an OO language, or anything. So
Yeah.
exposure to these different things is really good. And you mentioned Ruby and Rails. That was one of the earlier frameworks that applied MVC and some of those design
Yeah.
patterns
Yeah.
in a reasonable way and introduced some people to that. So it's quite useful.
Before that, I was in some really crazy PHP and Perl kind of website code where there was no separation between the website and the database, and all that. It was a nightmare, with some SQL thrown in as well, maybe right into the website. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, around 2009, I was more exposed to WordPress. So we won't talk about open source and WordPress. We'll avoid that whole mess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. But I'd love to do more of a Lisp language. So I'm quite interested in playing with Clojure sometime again.
Yeah.
I've had a very brief play with Lisp when I go at a coding challenge around it. But apart from that, I haven't dug into it too much.
Yeah. One of the things actually right after Clojure I picked up is Elixir. And I know recently Phoenix, the web framework for Elixir, has gotten pretty big. Lots of people are using it. I haven't tried Phoenix, so that's one of my goals. Maybe over the next year or so, I'll learn that.
Cool. Yeah, there's so many fun things to go and learn and try, aren't there?
Yeah.
Cool. I said this would be about half an hour, but as usual,
Yeah.
I've gone way past that. So we're 55 minutes in. Any last thoughts or points that you'd like to share now?
I didn't actually think through this in terms of like points, but I would say you actually brought up the two most important things. We are maybe the third time I'm reiterating them, but finding the right people, maybe even generalizing mentor, right? That you like working with, but also learning from, and making learning a continuous process, whether it's from people or from new technologies, new software. That is, I think, the best way to grow in your software engineering career. right? Is different perspectives, always being open to those perspectives, try out new things. And I think the more you do it, the easier it becomes. The like From my personal perspective, and I've seen it in a lot of other like developers later on, is if somebody has been coding in, let's say, Java their entire life, right? If you throw them into Dart or into TypeScript, they're going to hate it, and they're going to look
Yeah.
for the same ways of doing the same thing before. And maybe that struggle will last for a while, but eventually they'll start to learn from the new thing and do idiomatic things in that new language. And it'll actually enrich their own programming style in the long run. But it is hard in the beginning if you are just used to doing things, or you love, let's say, I don't know, Kotlin, right? I love Kotlin. Even to this day, I love Kotlin. But I'm never going to go and say like I'm only going to code in Kotlin, right? It depends on, maybe it's a systems piece of software and I need to pick up Rust for it or Go for it, and so be it, right? The more you transition through these languages and processes, the faster you get at doing that,
Yeah,
right? And I'm sure
absolutely.
right now, when you said you're going to go pick up Clojure or I'm going to go pick up Elixir, I have a confidence that like within about 3-4 days, I can be reasonably good in Elixir or Closer, even if I've never been exposed to like that style of programming before. And that is only because I've tried it so many times before, like throwing myself into this weirdness of like, I don't know what the heck this syntax is. I don't know how to think through this. But the more you do it, the faster you become and the better you become at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And to prove your point, I've had a few customers where I've gone in as a consultant and they've said, we've got this problem, everything's broken, building's burning down, we need this code fixed ASAP. Great, where's the code? Look at the code, and it could be in a language that I've not dealt with before. So I've had to sit there, figure out how do you build it, how do you deploy it, what is it, and what the hell does this code do? So I've
Yeah.
done plenty of times where I've had to come in and review code in a language I've not seen before. I then start
Yeah.
fixing it.
Yeah.
And as you say, the more exposure you have to different languages, different styles of languages, the easier that becomes.
And I think that's important to like on your path to become a senior engineer. And also, you never know, right? Like you may not be working in the company that you're in love with right now. 5 years down the line, you want to look for a different, or the industry overall changes, maybe, right? Like we went from C++ to Java in the matter of maybe 5-6 years, and everybody was building everything in Java.
Yeah,
Right now it's all like web apps. Like you wouldn't think beyond like JavaScript. There's like 15 different ways of building a JavaScript, but you wouldn't think usually beyond JavaScript to like build a web app. So if you have to change those kind of, make those kind of career transitions, make it easy on yourself and like kind of be used to switching tracks and learning from different ways.
yeah, absolutely, 100%. So thank you very much, Arnab. So where can people learn more about yourself, mentoring, and Metacast, most importantly?
So Ilya and I, my co-founder Ilya and I, we do our own podcast where we talk about Metacast. We launched like 6 months ago the app in iOS and Android. It's a linear growth, slow growth, but it is growing. We're getting more and more people using it every week. We get a lot, like I said, I get a lot of joy of like people using software that I've built, and so that's growing, and that sense is growing, that it is actually meaningful. But we do document all of our ups and downs, kind of struggles that we go through, as well as the positives. uh, I want to say monthly, 2 to 3 times, sometimes more, sometimes less. That's called our Metacast behind the scenes podcast. And then we have another more, I think, infrequent podcast called Builders Gonna Build, where you were there last year. Actually, since last year, we haven't launched anything, but we just recorded one last week that's going to come out soon. So on that podcast, like you are doing in this podcast, we bring on people who are building things. Whether it's like you said, you're like running a coding challenges, or somebody's building like a product of their own. We try to bring on those people and learn from their journeys. So it's kind of like a founder's journey kind of podcast. So those are the two of our podcasts where you can listen to more if you like what we're talking about here. Aside from that, metacast.app has all the information about the app, and Ilya and me in the about page of that, where you can find our entire history and how things led to what. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Arnab. It's been a pleasure
Yeah.
talking to you.
Thank you.